Nobody's perfect, and if there's one area where that's especially true, it's forecasting. You could hand the same data set to 15 different analysts, and I guarantee that you're going to get 15 different forecasts. The only thing that they're all going to have in common is that they're all wrong. That's just the nature of the beast. But here's the thing. Accuracy isn't actually the most important part of building a forecast. Precision is. What this means is that while you might not get every single detail of your forecast perfectly accurate, if you at least have a precise and sound approach and everyone's aligned with all of your assumptions, you're going to be in good shape. So, in today's video, I want to talk about some of the biggest mistakes that I've made or I've seen made in my career when it comes to forecasting. More importantly, I'm going to show you how to avoid them. Plus, if you stick around, I'm going to throw in a little bonus where I'm going to be putting on my CFO hat and share 2 more pro tips that are going to make you stand out like the stud you already are. So let's dive in. The number one mistake that I've seen throughout my career seems like it should be so simple, yet here we are. It's not accounting for seasonality or normal fluctuations in business activity. Look, not all businesses are created equal. A software company is going to behave differently in revenue patterns than, say, a manufacturing company or a consumer goods company. You've got to recognize when your business has seasonal peaks and troughs. So take, for example, agriculture. There's going to be a harvest season. For accountants, tax season is a huge spike in business. And for retail, the holidays are massive. Knowing that, if your business has seasonal patterns of behavior, you can't just smooth out your growth across the year and call it a day. And that's why this is mistake number 1, because it can seriously mislead your planning, especially cash. And I don't know, rumor has it cash is kind of important, so let's not do that. Now, well, that's all well and good. How then do we avoid this in a tactical sense? Let's jump into an example and talk it out. Let's do that right now. All right, so this is a seasonal business. If it was not a seasonal business, it would be a very boring line, hopefully going up and to the right, some level of slope, a little bit of variability, but not these gigantic bumps that you see here. This is an example. It's actually not that obnoxious. There are going to be businesses that have this sort of fluctuation throughout where they've got busy season, they've got low season. This one appears to be, it starts at the beginning of the year and it spikes and peaks just before summer hits, and then it kind of dips down, and then it starts to grow again at the end of, or the beginning of the following year. So first things first, I want to be very clear what we're looking at or what we're not looking at. This is not a complicated model. This is not intended to impress anybody. This is intended to provide an example of a fictitious business with revenue that comes in a seasonal way. We're going to call it a single product business. No, like maybe it's not even a single product business. This could be a 50 product business, and this is just one revenue line. Doesn't matter. The intent of this instructional or this review is to show an example of how one might capture and forecast seasonal fluctuations like what we're seeing here. Now, just by looking at this, let's orient ourselves here a little bit. First off, we've got some controls. We've got a full year summary that includes a sum of all of these monthly actuals over here. It's got a year-over-year growth factor where we can calculate it. We've got a graph with a visual. I always recommend, if you're doing some sort of forecasting, or even if you're not, if you're just dealing with time series data, having a visual reference is always handy to have, just because it's hard to really digest context when you're just looking at a wall of numbers or a sea of numbers. Having this just makes sure that weird stuff doesn't just necessarily slip through the cracks. Like if there was a funky number here, I'd be able to see it in the graph, right? But right now it looks fairly reasonable. I have no reason to suspect that there's anything wrong outside of the fact that it just stops here, right? But that's what we're here to deal with. Another thing, the pretend situation here is like, hey, what if we're planning for next year? And usually you don't do planning for next year like at the beginning of next year. You don't have actuals. So we're just saying, hey, we've got actuals through the end of Q3, September of 23. Again, we're going back in time. And the idea there is that, hey, we're going to not only have to predict next year, but like Q4 of this year. So just bear in mind, like this is sort of some level of reality that I've injected in an otherwise kind of overly simplified situation. I've also got these year-over-year growth assumptions that we're going to key in for 2024 using a worst case, most likely, and a best case scenario. You can choose the case that you want to model, and it's going to eventually be driving our assumptions over here. You can also choose like when the actuals are through right here in case you wanted to update this. But I want to be very clear. This is typically not how you're going to model. You don't just say, we're going to grow at 15% next year or 7.5. Like there's more that goes into a real life forecasting process. And I want you to be okay with knowing that, and that I'm going to be kind of using this as a proxy. As we go further in the forecasting process through this series, we're going to get deeper into what that looks like. But realistically, again, this could be one product within a business, and each of those products has a volume number and a rate number. And that means that we have pricing and we have volumes and we have customer counts, and we've got all of these different moving pieces and levers that we need to build assumptions around. It's not just we're going to grow at this and everyone's okay with that. It's not that simple. But for our purposes, it's going to have to be that simple because I'm breaking down the topic of seasonality. I want to show you we've got this actuals tab. So the idea here is that maybe you just extracted revenue from our ERP. You've got this account. It's just 4,000 widget sales month to month. You got your revenue number. And that is coming out over here where we're just summing the revenue based on the month that we're in. Wonderful, beautiful. And then this chart is driven off of this. So nothing super curious about that, but this is what we're doing. This is the exercise now. So how do we forecast in a way that takes the seasonality into effect? First off, there's a lot of ways that you can do it. I'm going to come straight out the gates though and say that the way that I would not recommend that you do it, certainly not if you're new to forecasting, is by simply coming in and saying forecast, like, look, this function equals forecasts. Don't use this. Don't, like, if you understand the regressions and the things that this thing is doing, that's all well and good. I actually probably hate these functions more than I do pivot tables. And if you saw my last video on pivot tables, you know that I don't actually hate pivot tables. They have their use cases. I just don't like them for presentation layer work. There's a similar alignment that I have here around, like, if I'm legit building a forecast, I am not going to use a forecast function and then go present that to somebody and say like, well, this is what Excel told me it was. No, use this thing, understand your business, understand the drivers, understand the levers, understand the factors that you're dealing with, understand the scenarios that you're going to plan around. Don't just use an out-of-the-box solution to do this thing and then just point at it. I feel similarly about AI. Like comes a point where does the human stop and the machine take over, and where is the accountability lie? And I want to make sure that we are being thoughtful humans that understand the business and don't just cop out and say like, well, the function told me so. It's not good enough. Not only that, and I didn't expect to go on a rant here. Maybe I did. I also see a lot of like time series, people using statistical models and things like that. And again, these things have their place, but when it comes to forecasting, I can't think of something more worthless than taking a bunch of squiggly lines and saying like, that's the line that we're going to run with. That demonstrates zero understanding of your business, zero understanding of the drivers, and zero effort on your part to trying to capture those things and articulate it in a way that you can then enhance your understanding of the business. This is one of the things when I'm talking about precision versus accuracy. I don't care that your model is wrong. I care that you put some thought into the drivers, and that at the end of the day, you can track actuals against those drivers, and that you can come to some sort of conclusion around like, oh God, oh gee golly, I thought that this would be X, but it ended up being Y. Okay, great. That's a data point. Why did you think X and why did Y happen? Did you have control over this or did you not? How are you going to plan for that in the future? Okay. So again, I'm sure that there's going to be some some data nerds that are going to get really upset with the things that I'm saying, come at me, bro. Let's talk about it. But I digress. So what are we going to do? Now, I'm going to go the complete polar opposite of all of these crazy fancy statistical models, and I'm going to use a crazy simple method to forecast this. And I will put my crazy simple methods up against just about any other method out there. Here's the other thing in a model. The more fancy you get with the spices, the more likely you're going to be wrong in inexplicable ways. The more drivers that you develop, the more places for it to break. Focus on the powerful few that have the most impact on the business, and then use the rest as your explanations down the line. And as you learn more about the way that things influence one another, you can refine those assumptions, but don't come out the gates with 700 drivers. Keep it simple. So how do we keep it simple? First off, I've got revenue by month, and it stops where the actual stop. I've just done this math here to show year-over-year growth, just as a proxy. And I've got these placeholders here for seasonal factor and annual projection. Let's do seasonal factor first. What this means is I want to do some math to determine what is the normal seasonal percentage of revenue that occurs in any given month. It's easy math. Let's go equals revenue for the month divided by SUMIFS, all the revenue. We're going to go out to the end of time. Okay. And for that, where the year, for that sample is for the year, and I don't need to do anything with that. And I go close that, enter, and that says that for January of 2021, 8.5% of revenue for the year was realized. A way to check this real quick is to say equals my annual projection based on that seasonality factor would mean that, hey, if revenue was this, if I divide that by the seasonal factor, that means that my revenue for January should be 1,007,379. Look at that. That is my revenue. This is just a sum over here. So that tells me this is right. So what I can actually do now is take this copy and bring it all the way over. I'm going to just, for demonstration purposes, go all the way to the end, paste it, and we have all of that. It's all broken over here, but that's fine. I did that on purpose. So this number should be the same until we get to 22. And once we get to 22, that number goes to 1153, 1153. Notice as I was kind of orienting, I might have glossed over, this is a summary by year, and we've got our year over year growth. And that's just going to be as an example as we kind of continue to build this out, talked about the drivers, et cetera, et cetera. So we get to this place in Q4 where the actuals end and the forecast begins and the model breaks down. And I'm using the term model incredibly loosely right now because it is anything but at the moment. Like right now, we're just doing some basic math. But you get to this place in the year and you see, oh, wait a minute, we have an annual number here, but 23 is not done yet. Does that make sense? So this 10.7% is based on only the part of the year that's been done. So if that were true, then that would mean that we're only going to hit this 1,032,000 for the year, and that's going to be 10% loss of growth, but that's because we're not counting Q4. It's not there yet. So that actually means that I need to remove all of this, delete it all. Now we have to figure out, what does it all mean? What does it all mean? Where are we actually going? Here's where the fun begins. So now what I need to do is actually assume some level of seasonality based on the historical data that we have so that I can project where we're going to end up. And you can do that in a number of ways. The first thing that I'm going to do, though, is just say, hey, we have a couple of years of sample. Let's just use those as an average. So I'm going to go equals average January of 21 and January of 22. Enter. On average, over the past 2 years, 8.6% of annual revenue has come in January. Now, if I take that and I take this and I copy and paste that back again, that would imply that 2023, with 1 month of data, might be around $1.286 million. Okay, that's good to know. I'm going to now take these numbers and blow them out through to our actual end, paste, and you see the numbers are they're all over the place, but they're within a reasonable range, right? This is actually the widest spread. We've got 1.28 versus 1.377, less than $100,000 swing. That's not too bad. We can work with this. How do we work with this? Well, now what I need to do, if I were to take this, copy this and bring it over, 7.1%. That means that in October, the average of the last 2 years in October has been 7.2%. Good to know. If I want to use that, then I need to back into my revenue number. I need to know what this number should be. Like, we need one of those numbers as a factor. So what I'm actually going to do is go equals average of my year-to-date projections at 4, and actually I'm just going to hit enter. And that tells me that my average projection for the year based on the year-to-date data is about 1.336, right? That's a good number. I mean, it makes sense actually. So then if I take that and I multiply it by this number, my seasonal average, that says that my January number might be $94,000 or $95,000. Good to know. So then if I'm going to take this, I'm going to drag it forward, and now this number should be consistent from here forward if I continue to take this and go through here, paste, here, copy these, bring them over, paste, and there we go. And notice it's slowly populating our chart. Nothing here looks too crazy, like it kind of makes sense. And this is now our full year number, our target, at least for these months, based on that average. And then you see here, this says that we actually grew 15.9% for the year. I could get behind this. This makes more sense to me now that we're taking a look at it. So what we've done now is we've effectively projected through the end of the year. Now we need to project based on that, build off of that, and to get into 2024. How do we complete this seasonal cycle? Now we need to get out of the year, and a couple ways that we need to be careful about this is, number one, so we copy this and we paste. Now we're getting into a new situation where we got a new year, and we should actually have an extra year's worth of data. So let's do that. Let's bring in January, part of our average, boom. That's going to make that a slightly more robust sample. We can take that and we can bring it all the way out and pick your poison. Some may not like this, but once you get into October, let's take a look at this. What it's actually doing is it's using our forecast in the average sample. I do have somewhat strong opinions on this. It's sort of like a form of circular reference to me, like taking an average of an average. I don't think it's going to break anything, but I also think it's probably not the best practice to include that in your sample. So for our purposes, I'm going to delete it at this point. And now we're back to having 2 years of examples, but that's okay. I think we can work with that. So I'm going to copy that and move it forward, paste, okay. Notice the numbers didn't really change, and they wouldn't because it's sort of like, again, it's taking an average of those two things anyway, sort of reinforcing the average. Now, I just need to start to plan this out. So I'm going to take this number here, copy, paste. Look at that. I'm going to copy this and bring it all the way over to the end, paste, and we can just take this for fun and bring it down and paste. And oh gee golly, look at this. It's a little bit of a really boring flat line. Look, it's negative 0.1% growth, aka just flat. This is year over year flat. And why is that? It's because all of our numbers are based on this average of what we thought 23 would be. Okay, well, we can fix that. And we can fix that by saying this is what we thought the year would be. Now, what we want to do is actually, we're going to average of the entire thing. Actually, there's a few ways that you can do this, because if we're already making a stand that we think that we know what the number is going to be, We could just take the number that we want to be. I want to be relatively consistent in my formula structure here, so I'm going to keep it as an average. I'm just going to extend it out through the end of the year. And we need to inject our growth factor now. Again, our oversimplified growth factor. So I'm going to say that times, open parentheses, 1 plus XLOOKUP. What are we looking up? Our scenario, F4, comma. Where are we going to find it? It's right here in our assumptions, F4. And what are we going to retrieve? The growth factor, F4. Close that parenthesis and close the other parenthesis. And if we hit enter, now we've entered into the new year. And I'm going to copy that, bring it all the way over, paste, and voila. We now have 7.4% growth. That's consistent with our worst case scenario. And this is now dynamic. So if I were to say, if actually we don't want to use our worst case, we want to use our best case. And boom, we're almost at 20% growth. You see it actually starts to slope up a little bit. That's awesome. If we wanted to change this down to our most likely case, there you go. Seasonal factors intact. It's not just a complete replica of these. It's got its own unique characteristics based on the averages. And you have a defensible position at this point. So with that, that is one way of many, depending on how creative you get, where you can forecast a seasonal business. Let's get back up and keep talking about these mistakes. Let's go for it. All right, now it's time for mistake number 2, which ties in nicely with seasonality in a way. And this is when you let anomalies affect your forecast. Here's an example. Maybe a celebrity randomly tweets about your product and sales just skyrocket for a month. Should you bake that into your forecast for next year? I don't know what's worse, forgetting that these things happened and simply not addressing them in the forecast, or being well aware that they're in your numbers and actively planning for this random big event to happen again next year. I've actually been asked a lot, if these random events happen from time to time, shouldn't we try to plan for them? My answer is always going to be a hard no. And here's why. So riddle me this. Would you rather walk into a meeting having to explain a missed forecast because something crazy happened that you couldn't have predicted? Or would you rather walk in having to explain why your forecast showed revenue doubling in 1 month because you expected something crazy to happen and it just didn't? I know which camp I'm in. So in the end, I think it's better to smooth out those anomalies. And if something extraordinary does happen, use that as a variance explanation, not a forecast assumption. Let me show you an example right here. Let's jump in. All right, we're back at it. This should look familiar because it's the same thing. I haven't done anything else. So baking in anomalies. So let's just play pretend here. Let's just say in 2022, 2023, something like that, some celebrity decided to tweet that we have an awesome widget and they highly recommend it. And instead of 111,000 in June here, we actually had 215,000 just flying off the shelves. We just obliterated our stock. And oh my God, look at that spike. Okay. What happens is this spike is now influencing our numbers, right? You come down here and you see in 2023, you've got this number. Look at that, 2.6 million. That is corrupting our average. That is inflating everything. You see it here too with this 15.3. So it's not a huge impact, but it is an impact. And if you weren't using the approach that we're doing, which inherently has some level of smoothing, bonus points, you could really screw things up, especially if you're literally taking prior year plus some growth factor, which is something a lot of people do. I don't recommend that necessarily. There may be use cases, but that's the way that some people may do this. Don't do that. We are lucky that it's being smoothed based on our approach, but it's still influencing, and we don't want that. We don't want that impact to be inflating our numbers. So what do? You ask a bunch of people how they do this, they're going to have a bunch of different answers. I'm going to give you one answer. It is my immediate answer because it's easy to administer, but it could introduce some challenges, and I'm sure that people have other thoughts. But here's what I would do, because we're pretending that this is real. First off, don't touch actuals. Actuals are actuals are actuals. Leave them alone. That also means you don't touch this. This is a number that we are calculating and that we have every right to make adjustments to. So let's do that. Let's leverage the power of our minds here. And instead of just taking this as straight math, I am actually going to take this and go equals average of these and everything before it, because that's the month that has the average. And now what we've done is injected an average in this factor. So what that does is then says that when we're doing this average, it's no longer being impacted by some huge spike, and it should normalize everything. Okay. And it's interesting too, because what it does is says that our growth goes down to 6.4%. And that's actually more accurate because it's 7.5% off of a normalized year. And we need to be aware of that. Like, why would you say that you want 7.5% growth, knowing that a huge chunk of revenue wasn't like something to organically build from? So that's something to be aware of as well. Don't be jarred when you see this. Have a clear explanation. If people say like, "Oh, but we want 7.5% growth," okay, great. Let's factor that in. Let's plan for that. But you don't want to build it off of this. So now what I'm going to do though is, you see this little green guy, right? If you hand this off to another analyst eventually, or if you come back to this in a couple months, you're going to forget what you did. I promise you. Or someone else is going to see this and go like, "Oh, gee, what's going on here?" And they're just going to like overwrite your work. So one way to approach this is to take that, highlight it, right click, add a note, and just say smoothed anomaly from prior year. Done. Now you've got a note. Now you've got it called out. We can even make it bold. Do whatever you need to do to attract attention to it. Add it to your instruction tab, because you should probably have something like that. Add it to a log. Make sure that everybody is aware that this was done so that you could have a more accurate forecast. And that is one way that you can approach dealing with anomalies. You need to smooth them. You need to make sure that they don't influence the next year. And this is one way to do it. Let's jump back into the mistakes. The third mistake I've seen made, and made myself, is not building models with longevity in mind. You don't want a one and done disposable forecast that you throw away at the end of each quarter. Your model should be something that you can update and refine and improve over time as you gain a better understanding of the business and its drivers. If you're just slapping together numbers for a quick forecast and not thinking about how to feed actuals into the model and use it on a rolling basis, you're kind of wasting time and energy. These models, they should be flexible enough to handle updates, whether that's adding in actuals or modifying growth drivers or building out new scenarios. So the idea here is to create a model that evolves with your business. So let's look at a few steps that you can take to make this a reality. Finally, building with longevity in mind. Let's talk about it. Look, we've already done some elements of that by building in some level of controls. And I think this is a lot of where it comes down to. Building with longevity is going to be things like making sure that if you want to add more actuals, you can load in more actuals, versus like taking numbers, transforming them, pasting values, doing all sorts of stuff. That's never going to come out well. Make sure that you've got a repeatable process for loading actuals. Make sure that you've got easy to use controls and assumptions. Make sure that you've got documented use of functions and ways that you can just continue to let things roll. And at the end of the day, this is going to be scalable, and you can continue to layer on different areas that you want to forecast for your business. So it seems like common sense, but a lot of times it's just not, and hopefully that helps. Let's get into the bonus stuff. All right, well, I told you up front that if you stuck around, you'd get a couple of bonus lessons. So the time has come, and I'm ready to throw on the crusty old CFO hat and share with you some of the goods. So let's get into it. Bonus lesson number 1. Don't overshoot the impact of initiatives. One thing I've seen time and time again, especially in budget season, is everyone comes in with their pet project or initiative and tries to justify it by saying it's going to drive massive growth next year. Maybe it's a marketing campaign, or maybe it's a new product launch. Whatever it is, here's the reality. Initiatives rarely roll out exactly as planned. They're often late or they don't perform as expected, and the next thing you know, the 15 different initiatives you compounded and baked into the budget, they're all kind of fizzling and you're way off target. If you bake in too many initiatives, each one carrying aggressive targets, you're setting yourself up for a painful year where you have to constantly explain why you missed forecast. Not only that, the truth is going to be hard to pinpoint outside of, I don't know, we shot for the stars and landed somewhere out in the Atlantic. Send help, right? So let's all agree to avoid the hockey stick shaped forecast where everything is just magically going to improve in Q4, because guess what? It won't. So if you're ever in one of these situations, try to be the voice of reason and plan for 1, maybe 2 or 3 initiatives that the whole business can rally behind, and try not to shoot the moon with any one of them. Also make sure that you can track your performance before you get started. And that opens up the door to our final lesson, bonus number 2, which is to anticipate questions and build scenarios. This is actually related to the prior note there, that you should always be prepared to answer the tough questions that your CEO or CFO or the board are all going to ask. Like, what if this doesn't go to plan? Or what happens if we only hit 80% of our sales target? What if that super deluxe widget with the enhanced X-ray vision doesn't launch on time? This is where scenario planning comes in, and you need to be ready to show best case, worst case, most likely case scenarios. And this is where some of the planning around those initiatives might come in handy. So if we fire on all cylinders and all of these initiatives hit, that's going to be a best case scenario. If we miss on all of them and we just kind of flounder for the year, that's going to be your bear case or a worst case. If we hit on a couple of initiatives and improve in some areas of the business organically, that's going to make for a defensible and hopefully solid forecast that others can rally behind. Now, if you recall in the last video, we also talked about sensitivity analyses, and I think that folds nicely into this concept of scenario planning. So if you haven't checked out that video, I encourage you to do so and make sure that you go build out some of those scenarios ahead of time so that you look prepared, thoughtful, and highly capable when those tough questions come your way. All right, let's recap. Here are the 3 biggest mistakes in forecasting that you should try to avoid. Number 1, don't ignore seasonality if your business has that. Don't bake in anomalies. Be sure to smooth those out. Always build with longevity in mind. Your models should evolve with you in the business. And finally, be careful when forecasting the impact of initiatives, and always come prepared with scenarios to answer the inevitable what if questions. All right, I hope you're enjoying this forecasting series. If you found this helpful, let me know in the comments. And if you want to stay in the loop for when the next video drops, don't forget to do all the things. You like, you subscribe, you ring the little bell thing for notifications, and you can always stay informed and gain an edge in your career. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video where we dive even deeper into the world of forecasting. See you there.